Hello everyone, Storm here, and today we are going to be doing what is probably the most popular and most requested Walking Dead what if for the Telltale games. What if Lee survived? This one is going to be a literal game changer, so we've got a lot to cover. Also, if you haven't played the games, go buy them and play them now. It'll be a much better experience if you don't get spoiled so hard. Anyway, if you enjoy my content, please be sure to like and subscribe. And as always, be sure to join my Discord and follow me on Twitter. Links in the description. So to start off, there are two ways we can take this story. We can either have Lee never be bitten, or have him survive the bite by cutting his arm off. For this one, we're gonna have him cut his arm off a bit earlier, cause my friend Diamond Legend has already made his version where Lee never got bit. But anyway, this timeline is going to be triggered by your choices. In this version, the group being aware will make whoever went along with you focus more on Lee. Because of this, they will wake him up earlier after he passes out, allowing for them to cut his arm off much sooner. He then passes out again, waking up around the same time he did in canon. Since Lee loses out on sleep from the first nap, and the second one will take the leftover time as well, that way we don't have any time changes in the actual story. The crew then escapes the hospital and many events play out the same. The group still has no clue if losing the arm worked, so they'll be just as skeptical as in canon. Eventually, Kenny gets separated from the group, and Lee leaves alone to find Clem. Lee would see the horde of walkers, and would decide to make a risky decision. He kills a walker and drags it out behind a building, covering himself in the guts. He isn't sure that this will work, but like cutting his arm off, it's the only chance he's got. Thankfully, this does work, so he makes it into the Marsh house with little difficulty. He goes in, resulting in the stranger's death, and the duo of him and Clementine making it through the walkers. The difference is that Lee wouldn't pass out in the street, so the two would just continue out to the countryside. There they would find Omid and Krista, who would be happy that Lee was alive. And now we follow into Season 2. This time, Lee would stand outside while the other three did their thing. When the girl pulls up, she'd threaten Lee to give her his stuff, as she saw he only had one arm, so he would be an easy target. He would decline and she begins attacking. However, Lee is a really strong dude, so he's gonna be able to defend himself. The girl is then forced to run away, and the group carries on. Krista and Omid's baby would be stillborn due to nobody with any sort of experience dealing with birth being there. This would take a pretty heavy toll on the four, but not nearly as much as it did in canon, since Krista had to also deal with Omid's death then. Here, she's got multiple people she cares about alongside her. Once the 16-month time skip is finished, the group would all be sitting around the fire. Luckily, Lee had already picked up wood, so none of them had to leave to go find any. It is then that the three men from the original attack the group, forcing them to escape. During this encounter, Krista and Omid get separated as Lee protects Clementine. The two then fall down a river and wake up the next morning on the shore. Lee assures Clementine that they'll be alright, and so they carry on, eventually coming across Sam the dog. Lee opens up the can of food, and then passes it to Clem, who either shares it with the dog, or eats it herself. Either way, Sam is going to start biting her arm, but Lee is having none of that. He instantly pushes him off of Clem before killing the dog. He lost his gun in the river, so the knife was all he had. He checks Clementine's wound and asks if she's okay, to which she is for the most part. It isn't nearly as bad due to Lee's help, so they'd be able to run across the woods and be found by Pete and Luke. After escaping the walkers, Pete would ask Lee about his arm, and he would tell him that he was bit and decided to cut it off. Hearing this, the old man would tell Luke that he told him it could work, and speaking of Luke, he is questioning Clementine's wound, but Lee makes it known that it wasn't a walker. If it was, why wouldn't they cut it off, or ask them to? They already know about how that works, so, there's really no point in not doing it. Pete says that's fair enough, and so they go toward the cabin. Once there, the rest of the group steps out, examining the two along with Carlos. They're unsure if they are spies from Carver, so they proceed with caution, making the two spend the night in the shed. Lee can either understand their worry or be upset that they wouldn't help a little girl. Nevertheless, the two are forced into the shed and would have to wait it out. Lee wouldn't like this and can either choose to have Clementine steal supplies or wait until the morning. He obviously isn't going to fit through the hole in the shed, and I don't think Clem in her condition could properly break the lock, so he's got to gamble by sending her out there. Or he doesn't, depending on your choice. And even if she could break the lock, it really is very unlikely that they wouldn't be caught if both of them are sneaking around the house. Either way, Clem would get herself patched up at some point, and the two would go with Nick and Pete the next morning. Lee would tell Clem to stay around Nick while he goes around to look with Pete. This way, when Pete gets attacked by a walker, Lee is able to stomp its head in before it bites him. Now the herd approaches, and so Lee can either tell Clem to come to him or to run. If she runs, then she goes with Nick, and that plays out as it does in canon. But if she goes with him, then the two escape along with Pete. They get stuck in the truck, and Lee would have some time to bond with Pete. I kinda like that idea, as they're both somewhat old and wise men, and understand what's important in life. Now, because Pete isn't bitten, he would be in fine condition to run once night hits, and so they'd make it back to the house. There, the two would find Clementine if she wasn't already with them. She'd say that Nick was still out there, and the rest of the group would go to find him. Carlos leaves Lee and Clem with Sarah, telling them to keep her distracted. They find her playing with a gun, and Lee tells her to put it down. She apologizes and says that she was just interested, and that's where an interesting decision would be made. Lee has the option to try and teach Sarah how to use a gun, or he can respect Carlos's wishes and just do something else. If they go with the latter, then they just take pictures, but the former would lead to Lee letting Clementine train Sarah. He can't really show her how to hold a gun properly, because he's only got one arm, so Clementine is going to do it herself with his supervision. Carver then makes his appearance, and Lee tries to lock the door, however he opens it before he can, so there's no avoiding Carver now. He basically gives Lee the same talk as he did to Clem, with the two girls hiding in the background. Lee would try to get him to leave, but it just wasn't going to happen. The only way to stop him would be to use violence, but he had a gun, so that wasn't going to work either. Once he leaves, Lee gets back to teaching Sarah, or they wait until the group returns. Once they do, everyone gears up to leave and they head out. During the 5 days that they're traveling, I think both Pete and Lee would try to get Carlos to let Sarah learn to survive. If they're going to be out here on the road, she's in more danger than she was before. Carlos is a little less resilient given how his friend Pete was on Lee's side, and plus, Lee would also add how the way he lost his arm was because Clementine wasn't ready. She wasn't aware of how bad the world and people could be, but Sarah needs to know. And so Carlos says okay, and says that he will teach her. At the same time, Lee and Clem join Luke in on walking the bridge, but with Lee's help, they'd be a lot safer and would have less close calls falling off. They then meet Matthew, who offers the group to have some food and to go with him to their place. Since Nick isn't on edge due to Pete being alive, I don't think he would try to shoot Matthew here. And even if he did try, Pete would be there to stop him. So our group continues forward, and Carlos approaches Lee. There would be two different dialogue lines he would have here. He either thanks Lee for knocking some sense into him, or would say that Sarah knew how to hold the gun already. He's clearly a bit suspicious in that one. Lee can either play this off like she was smarter than he thought, or confess up to teaching her prior. Even if you lie, Carlos would be angry at first, but would say that he was only trying to lend a, well, he doesn't blame him, as he's clearly lost a lot. And so they continue on with no bad blood between them. Anyway, the group now joins Matthew, and they would meet Walter, Sarita, and Kenny. This would honestly be so goated, as Lee could finally reunite with him this time. They'd have a really nice moment together where they either hug or just talk about how they can't believe that it was real. Kenny would also make a comment that cutting the arm off worked. The two head inside with everybody else, and would have a seat rather than Kenny and Clem. Here they would reminisce on their past moments, with Kenny either apologizing to Lee for certain things, or thanking him for always being there for him. He would also say that he was sorry for dropping the walkie-talkie if you didn't save Ben, but it looks like it all worked out in the end anyway. Kenny would go further to ask where Krista and Omid are, but Lee has no clue. Finally, Lee asks how Kenny made it out, and he responds,
"I am a Christian man."
When dinner comes around, Lee and Clem each get their own choice of who they sit with, so that's pretty neat. After that, Walter and Lee would go off to talk outside, and it would be awesome to see them interacting. They're both teachers, so it's, really cool. They then see Bonnie, and Kenny steps outside. Walter gives Bonnie some stuff, and she leaves. The group deals with the whole turbine thing afterward, killing a bunch of walkers too. But Nick would never be killed, since Walter didn't have any reason not to save him, as Matthew is alive. Carver and his men then roll up, and Lee tells Clem to get inside, but when Carver starts beating up on Carlos, Sarah would be hesitating on running out due to her training. She would ask Clem what she should do, and she can either say nothing or tell her to stay inside. Anyway, if Clem says nothing, then Sarah will run out like in the game, but if she says to stay inside, well, she'd stay inside. Since they can't really bind Lee's hands, he's gonna have the option to try and undo Carlos's bindings like he requested Clementine to do in the original story. Speaking of Clem, she chooses whether to go find Kenny or go down to save Carlos. If Sarah is with her, she will end up going down no matter what. When Carver pulls Carlos up, if Lee undid his binds, he would punch Carver in the face, but this would lead to Carver beating in his face with his gun, so he's gonna lose his eye. Kenny then shoots at the random grunt, and Carver would take Walter and shoot him. This enrages Lee and Matthew, and Pete would become even more sad at the situation. Carver, seeing that he had more people to kill, wouldn't choose to grab Alvin next. We saw in the game that he beat up Alvin if he survived, and I think he'd still want to do that. He wants his revenge. So with so many other people expendable, he'd take someone else there to kill. This someone would be Pete, which Nick would not stand for. He charges in, but Troy would knock him to the ground, and because of that, Carver would kill Pete even if Clem stopped Kenny from shooting him again. And so, as a result, Kenny would shoot again, with this either landing for the first time or missing if he hit before. So next is Sarita, to which Kenny would stop firing and give up. Now our crew would be taken back to House, thus ending the episode. So episode 3 of season 2 starts with Clementine and Sarah in the forest talking to each other. Here, Sarah would want to know what she can do to help her father as she didn't want to stay with Carver. Clementine tells her not to do much for now, but to try to keep her emotions in check. Sarah thanks her for the advice and the two return to the group. In the truck, Kenny would be making the plan to cut the binds and would ask Lee to back him up. This comes down to your choice since you are partially playing as Lee and partially playing as Clementine. If you choose to help, Kenny will say that he knew he could count on you, but if you try to talk him down, he will either say that he was counting on you, or that you're still the same old Lee. This is depending on your choices from season 1 and how Kenny viewed you. The plan would fail either way, since Kenny would still hit his head and fall. The group is then forced into the pen once they arrive at House, and they now have to live at House. The next day, Sarah asks Clem what she can do yet again, and Carver yells at Carlos for it. He tells him to slap his daughter for talking, but if Carlos is missing an eye, he would have two excuses. His first would be his messed up hand, and the second would be that he can't see well enough to hit her. At that point, Carver becomes fed up with the excuses and just tells Troy to do it for him, so Troy slaps Sarah and the group moves on. Since we have both Lee and Matthew here, they'd be put on plant duty. This means that Reggie isn't gonna die, since they'd be competent enough to get it right. Other than that, not too much would really change for this part. Clem still finds Luke and they do the walkie-talkie plan, but when Carver finds out, that's when a change would occur. Lee would have a choice to take the blame for Clementine because she was the one with the walkie-talkie. Whether he does or doesn't isn't relevant though, because Kenny would just grab the walkie-talkie much faster than him like he did in canon. So Kenny still takes the fall for this and Carver beats him down. Now Lee is either going to sit by and comfort Clem, or he's going to charge in to help his friend. If he does that, both he and Clem will, so Lee would be taken down by Troy's rifle, and Clem would hit Carver. But Carver would simply smack her aside and proceed to continue his beatdown of Kenny. Lee is also held at gunpoint by Troy, and Matthew is restraining Sarita, so they're forced to let this happen. At this point, they come up with their final plan to bust out, and Carlos would work on Kenny. Clementine goes off to turn the intercom on, and all that plays out the same. She then returns jumping onto Carver's back, which allows for Lee and Luke to punch and disarm him. Carlos would also kick him if he had his eye crushed last episode. Kenny proceeds to shoot Carver's legs and grabs a crowbar. Lee can now either choose to let him do this or try to talk him out of it. Matthew and Sarita both try to stop him, and if Lee does so, he would tell him that there's no time, that Carver's already done, or to calm down. Either way, Kenny is going to deny the request, and Lee can either go silent or continue pushing him to stop. If the latter is chosen, Lee would say that this won't make him feel better or not make them fight again. And so if Lee kept on pushing it, Kenny would just get mad and simply just shoot Carver in the face before looking angrily at Lee and then leaving. But if you failed to convince him or just let him do it, then both Lee and Clem would head out and not watch. After that, all of them get covered in the walker guts and begin walking through the herd. Unfortunately, Carlos would still be shot, and this leads to Sarah freaking out and running off. I know I'm building her up to be a bit more hardened and willing to help, but that's not really saying much compared to how she was originally. losing her father isn't going to be completely altered by having a few days of gun training. And so Nick is also shot in the shoulder, going after her with Luke and Reggie. Lastly, Sarita would be bitten on the wrist, but Matthew would quickly kill the walker and they would leave with Kenny. Lee then stays behind with Clem to go with Jane and Rebecca. Most of this would remain the same, but with Lee giving his opinions on Jane and also Rebecca's situation with the baby. He tells her that if she's gonna have the baby, they need to do it with the right circumstances. He doesn't want a repeat of what happened with his friend Krista. The four eventually meet up with the rest of the group and Sarita would be on her way out. If Clem killed the walker originally, Sarita died from turning, and I think Kenny would have chopped her arm off if he thought there was the slightest chance of it working. But given that he didn't do that in the canon game and that we see them during the day, I think too much time has passed for them to save her. So that's what's going to happen here as well, unfortunately. Thankfully, Kenny isn't going to blame Clem though, since she wasn't even involved. A few figures would be seen in the distance. As they approached, they see Sarah, Luke, and Reggie. The group asks about Nick, and Luke would frantically shake his head no. Sarah needed some time to calm down in a safe place before they left via the skylight, but Nick was killed along the way. So yeah, Sarah did get herself together, she just needed a little bit more time. Clementine now gets the option to hug Sarah, and instead of Clem going with Mike and Bonnie and Jane, Clem would just go with Mike and Bonnie. This is because Lee is going to go with Jane. This leads to a similar thing with Arvo happening, and I think along the way Jane would commend Lee. He asks why, and she says that she's glad he prepared Clementine. He knows that his time is limited, so best not to drag her down too. Lee can either say that that's what he was going for, or that that's just what's best for everyone. Lee returns to the group, and would see Clem talking with Sarah and trying to help her out. He then goes to talk with Kenny, who would confide in Lee about what to do. And of course, our main character would of course help him out. When the walkers pull up, Lee would either try to convince Kenny not to beat down the one walker, or would cover him by killing other walkers like Mike did. The gang then regroups at the place they went to originally, but this time Sarah is going to be given a gun. They proceed to all defend the place from walkers as Rebecca gives birth before the deck begins collapsing. Here, it actually makes sense for Sarah to be on the deck since she's helping kill the walkers. In the actual game, she was just there. But, like in the game, she is still gonna fall. Thankfully, Matthew goes down there and tries to save her. He definitely doesn't seem like the type to let a little girl die. And with that, Lee and Clem tell Jane to help him, so she does, and the two cover them. It's implied Sarah freaking out too much was why she didn't escape, with Jane also being a little bit too weak. But since Sarah has a better state of mind, and both Matthew and Jane are helping, Sarah is going to make it out of there just fine. But this will lead to the death of Matthew, sacrificing himself to save Sarah and Jane in the end. Sarah also does have some minor wounds from the fall and the rubble landing on her. After that, they drop the whole deck and AJ is born. Jane still leaves the group, but not before Sarah thanks her. The group then chooses to head out, meeting Arvo and his people. Rebecca still turns, but Lee is going to put her down with no hesitation. He is not going to let this baby die. And speaking of death, his shot would cause everyone to start shooting. Now we've got like 4 more people, so that means the chances of death are much higher in this gunfight. So I think that we'll go ahead and just say Reggie dies, since he was already dead in canon. And we don't want to kill off Lee, and there's no point in killing off any of our characters who are alive in canon, because why would they die if they actually survived? Thankfully, because Sarah was helping out, she will actually survive as well, and Luke doesn't get injured since he had more people to cover him. Other than that, Jane returns, and they beat the other group, leaving only Arvo. At this point, Kenny starts going crazy on him, but Lee would tell him to calm down. Arvo would talk about the house that has food and all that stuff, and so they would eventually stop for the night at that one place that they did in canon. While they sit by the fire, Sarah would approach Lee. She suggests making some sort of makeshift weapon on his arm, and Lee would call her a genius. He had never even thought of that before. Sarah smiles and says that she read something like that in one of her books and she thought it might help. Lee then turns to Clem, asking why she never thought of that, and she would just roll her eyes while smiling. The night plays out the same, but with Lee helping convince Kenny to join them by the fire. The next day then happens, and they tread along the ice to get to the house. Now, while Luke isn't injured here, I think 2 more people, being Lee and Sarah, walking on the ice would still make it crack a bit. So now Luke is about to fall into the water, but Lee and Clem cover him. Bonnie then runs to try and pull him out, leading to them both falling in. I definitely think Lee would help out here though, so he begins breaking the ice. This does save Bonnie, but Luke is still done for, unfortunately. At this point, Lee and Bonnie are freezing, and so they get a fire going to get them warm before they freeze to death. Kenny also begins beating down Arvo, but Lee tells him to stop while shaking. Because he can't really stop him, Kenny is just going to continue to beat him down until Jane returns with the bag of supplies. Lee then takes a nap like Clementine did, and Kenny would get the truck working. But everyone still doesn't want to go to Wellington. It's up to Lee and Clem to say their choice, and Sarah just follows whatever Clem says. So late at night, Mike, Bonnie, and Arvo would try to make off with the supplies. Thankfully, Lee steps outside and tries to convince them to stop. However, that's when Arvo would shoot him with the rifle. Kenny, Jane, Sarah, and Clem all run outside and get Lee into the truck to keep him alive. When he wakes up, he would be sitting next to Clem and Sarah. They are both relieved that he's okay, and up front, Jane and Kenny are both arguing. Eventually, they get blocked by all the cars, so Kenny gets out to try to look for a way around. Walkers begin approaching the car, so Jane grabs AJ and books it out of there. Now Lee, Clem, and Sarah all walk in the snow together and make it to where Kenny is at. He asks where AJ is, and Lee would say that Jane took him. She then returns and says that she doesn't know where AJ is. Kenny and Lee both now go off looking, but don't turn anything up, especially because Lee is struggling to move around right now. Kenny approaches Jane, attempting to fight her, and she dodges, and then Lee would return. He tries to tell Kenny to back off, as presumably it wasn't her fault. Fighting now won't solve anything. They should listen to what happened, but Kenny tells Lee that they're done talking. He then charges in at Jane, and Lee would try to stop him. At that point, he gets between the two, and Kenny tells him to get out of his way, but Lee refuses. He says that he's not going to let him tear this group apart any more than he already has, and Kenny basically just cusses him out. He then throws a punch, knocking Lee back. Then, depending on what Lee did on the train, it would be a different dialogue. If he convinced Kenny to stop the train, he'd simply say that he was making the wrong move. And if he beat Kenny up, he'd say that he did it once and he'd do it again. And if he lost to Kenny, he'd say that he wouldn't lose this time. And so the two would now clash, with Kenny clearly having the advantage, since he's got an extra arm and Lee has just been shot. But, depending on the QuickTime events, Lee could still hold his own in this fight. I think gameplay-wise, it could be one of those cool fight scenes with QuickTime events, or at least cooler, you know, it's QuickTime events. So if you fail too many, he's just gonna get beaten down by Kenny. Clem would try to stop him, but this wouldn't work nearly as well since he already had the advantage, and Jane definitely isn't gonna step in to help. If she can prove her point by letting someone else get beat up and not risk herself, that's definitely what she would do. So if Lee loses, Kenny would just resume his normal fight with Jane, but if Lee keeps up in the fight, he would leave him a bit injured before getting knocked to the ground. I really just don't see Kenny losing a fist fight to Lee. Like, he is much stronger than Kenny, but he's just got too much of an advantage right now. Plus, Kenny is obviously angry, so he's got the adrenaline. Once Lee is on the ground, he would run out of energy, meaning that he could no longer intervene in the fight with Jane. It would all be up to Clementine whether she shoots Kenny or lets him kill her. If Clem looks away, Kenny would kill Jane and would begin to speak to Lee to try to apologize, but they would hear AJ crying, and so Sarah and Clem both go to find him. At that point, they all realize that Jane lied, and Kenny would defend himself by saying that she could have stopped it. She forced them into this situation. Here, I definitely think Lee has a tough choice. I lean toward him leaving Kenny behind, given that he has already refused to listen to reason, beat him up, and killed Jane in front of the girls. And once again, that death literally solved nothing. But at the same time, Lee and Kenny have both beaten each other up in Season 1 and basically forgave each other and moved on. Plus, they've been friends for the longest time, so I think it would be up to the player to decide whether they keep Kenny around. If they do leave him, he would agree that Lee was right. Now moving over to the other ending. If Clem fires her gun, Kenny would have a similar death to in canon, but would apologize to Lee. When they hear AJ crying, Clem and Sarah run off, while Lee stays behind to shoot Kenny in the head so he doesn't turn. Or if he really hates him, he won't do that. Up to you. They all find out that AJ is alive, and Lee becomes furious at Jane. I honestly cannot see him letting her stay with them at that point. He had just protected her, and Clementine had to kill Kenny over that? Kenny, who is basically Lee's best friend, and now you're gonna traumatize Clementine and Sarah because of this? And she literally could have stopped it at any point when she saw that other people were stepping in and that Kenny was actually serious. And so it would be a similar thing to with Lily, but because Lee has gone through so much more in the apocalypse and had to witness this basically firsthand, now twice if you include Lily doing that, I think that his evolution over the course of the series would just make him want to leave Jane behind. And so Lee would now take off with Clem, Sarah, and AJ. Now for both endings, I'm just not sure where they would end up. I could see Lee going to Wellington, especially if he keeps Kenny around. But if I do that, Lee is definitely going to give up his own chance for Clem's sake, so the story basically remains the same but with Sarah added in. Maybe I could have Lee appear in season 4 from that, but we miss out on a whole season of the story. So let's just say that they end up how Clementine does in the Alone ending, but this time they're not alone. But basically, they're all three just out surviving with AJ, not really going anywhere in particular, just trying to survive. So we left off season 2 with 2 endings. In one ending, Lee, Clem, and Sarah are alone, and in the other ending, Kenny is there as well. So for Kenny's ending, he is still gonna suffer the same fate as his canon counterpart. This means he gets launched out of the car while teaching Clementine how to drive. He loses all feelings in his legs, and Lee, Sarah, and Clem try to cover him. Kenny tells the three to go to save AJ, and so both Sarah and Clem would, with Lee staying behind. Kenny would tell him to get out of there, and Lee can either try to save him, or listen to Kenny and run with the girls. Either way, he is eventually forced to leave Kenny behind as there is no saving him. And if anyone was upset because Lee left Jane behind last part, just imagine he didn't, because even then, Jane is still gonna commit suicide when she finds out she's pregnant. But hey, since Clementine isn't ever alone, she wouldn't lose her finger in any of these endings. She probably wouldn't even have that cool scar she gets by staying with Kenny. There's 2 extra people helping keep her safe. At some point, Lee and the girls would be forced into the same position Clementine was after some walkers attacked them. They are forced to lock themselves into the room in the woods, and they then hear Ava yelling for help, so they would let her in. Ava thanks them and says that her and her friend got separated from their group, and now they're all separated from each other too. She would tell them about the new frontier and would ask the 3 of them to join and bring their baby. Clem can either say yes or no, but Lee is skeptical either way. He wants to join, as it would be far easier for him to keep AJ and the others safe. A one-armed man and 2 young girls aren't really the best protection and care for a baby. But he doesn't want to get into any traps either. Ava then hears walkers being killed outside the door. She tells them that it must be her friend, and so she opens the door and goes out to help her. Lee tells Clem and Sarah to guard AJ, and so he goes out with his gun in hand. By the time he gets out there, the walkers were all dead, and Ava walked out toward her friend. Lee then hears a familiar voice respond as Ava moves out of his way. It was Krista. Lee's face shows a clear surprise, and Krista looks back with the same expression. Clementine then steps out to make sure they're okay, and would see Krista as well. I think at that point Lee would be down to join them. Also, if you're wondering how Krista survived, she would explain to the group later that night. Omid had been killed by the people who attacked them, but he protected her while doing so. This allowed for her to hide and use walkers to her advantage, killing the guy who killed Omid. She tried looking for Lee and Clem, but never found any luck, and instead, she ended up with the new frontier. Lee explains that this wasn't the first time a thing like this has happened. They met up with Kenny maybe a year ago. Krista asks where he was, and Lee would respond with answers based on your season 2 ending. Either Kenny went nuts and Clementine shot him, he killed a woman in their group so they left him behind, or he died protecting AJ. The group would now spend their time with the new frontier, and Lee even has enough resources to make the arm weapon Sarah had thought of before. Think of Merle's arm from the TV show. But when AJ becomes sick, there's no doubt Lee would be in on stealing the medicine. When they get caught, Krista vouches for them to stay, but David isn't having any of it. He takes AJ, and Lee really can't fight him on that, as much as he wants to. So they are forced to say goodbye to him, and Lee leaves along with Clementine and Sarah. Krista would later approach them and give the 3 some supplies and drawings from AJ. She says that she knows what it's like to lose what kept you going, but they still have each other. If she hadn't gotten separated from them, maybe she would have had that too. But they have to count their blessings, and AJ will be a lot safer with the new frontier if he does pull through. She tells them goodbye and returns back to her group. And so now we can finally jump ahead to episode 1, since we've been covering all of this flashback stuff. Lee, Clem, and Sarah would appear to save Javier. They hold him up, but wouldn't rob him, since Lee knows that isn't right. Instead, they go on to help him by taking him to Prescott. There would be no deal to take his van after, though, since they were fine living at Prescott. And so, Clementine would never have to shoot anybody, since Lee would be there to keep her calm. Javi would leave with Tripp and the others in the morning, since there would be, no tension and he wouldn't be locked up. And so, they end up saving Javi's family, and Mariana gets shot by the new frontier. This time, they are all gonna leave as Clementine has no reason to stay behind. And so, the New Frontier would later attack Prescott. Thankfully though, our group all made it out alive. They then meet up with Jesus, but Conrad is never gonna flip out. Sure, Lee still told a story about the New Frontier to Javi, but Conrad knows he's not gonna be able to handle that many people if it gets rough. After all, it's gonna be Lee, Sarah, Clementine, and then if Javi takes their side, Javi as well. So that's 4 on 1, he's not gonna be able to do that. So he plays it smart and tells everyone their secret when they make it to the surface. But Lee is not gonna be having them being given up, and neither will Trip. He's been good friends with Lee for a bit, so he isn't willing to sell them out. They obviously aren't part of the New Frontier anymore, as they've spent so much time with Prescott, and they've actually been fighting the New Frontier. Anyway, they all pull up to Richmond, and David steps out to see them. He then takes Kate and Gabe and dips. Our group is now put into quarantine before David takes Javi to talk with Joan and Clint. They find out about him taking their gas, and so he and the others are all forced out of Richmond. They eventually make it to the safe place David told them to go, and David would make his return there. Lee questions what happened to AJ, and David responds that he lived. Afterward, the crew has to take on Badger, Lonnie, and Max. Because Lee and Sarah are both there, Lonnie definitely isn't going to be able to escape. There's 2 extra people. So now Lonnie is taken hostage, and Max is too if Javi spared him. And so, now they all pull up to Richmond and attempt to prove that Joan was corrupt. But Lonnie would just lie like he does in the actual game. Max would be telling the truth if he's there, but Lonnie would just say that they gave him a story to tell or they would kill him. And so with this, David would shoot Lonnie like he does in canon, and Javi and David would be taken into quarantine. Joan then returns and takes David, leading to Gabe or Kate freeing Javi. The group reconvenes in the house, where they find Ava and Krista. They both agree to take them to the armory, and so they do. Javier and Gabe head out with them, and Javi would find Lee, Clem, and Sarah. They were interrogating Lingard, who just wanted to die. Lee's opinion on this would be based on whether he let Ben go in Season 1. If he did, then he'd say to kill Lingard, but if he didn't, then he would tell him no. Of course, it does come down to Javi's choice, and they then decide to leave. When they make it back to the house, Conrad decides to dip out like he does in the actual game, and now Javi, Kate, Gabe, Lee, Sarah, and Clementine head out to get the truck. The whole thing is going to play out the same way, and they would then pull up the next day to Joan's meeting. There she would reveal all of the people she captured. They are David, Trip, Ava, and Krista. Joan says that she is going to kill David no matter what, but she'll let Javi spare one of the other 3. Of course, whoever you pick would then be killed instead, with Joan adding that she's actually being nice by doing this. She's sparing 2 that you didn't save, which is more than sparing the 1 that you did. And sadly, since most people will save Krista despite Javi barely knowing her, this means that Krista is going to die in most playthroughs. But anyway, Clint then says that they'll let them all go, and Javi can choose whether he shoots Joan or takes the deal. But if he takes the deal, David would kill Clint, and Lee would also kill Joan. Kate then crashes the truck, but thankfully Conrad will never die. This is because if you fail to dodge the truck, Sarah will grab Javi and pull him away instead. So now after this, the gang all regroups, with the 2 surviving people from Joan's murder being there as well. Of course, both of them are going to be a bit sour at Javi for not picking them, but they'd have to roll with it for now. If Krista survives, she's not coming with Javi and the gang. She's far too hurt after losing Omid and nearly dying after helping these people fight against her own group. And so the gang leaves with Trip, Ava, or both if Krista is dead. If it's Trip or Ava alone, they're both going to die like they did originally, and if it's both, they will both still die the same ways, though it would make the game suck so much worse to have both characters you save die back to back within 10 minutes. Anyway, Sarah would be able to make it across using the helicopter, as personally I don't think the weight of a teen was going to be too much for it to handle. This means that Javi is going to go too, but now Lee and Trip are both screwed. Walkers would begin approaching, and so they both die. Just kidding. They're going to hold the walkers off while Lee chops one and covers himself in the guts, but Trip is killed before he can cover himself. Also, if Trip died to Joan, then the group would just cover Lee while he does this anyway, so he's still going to survive no matter what. Thankfully, now Lee is able to slip through the walkers and go back where he came. Clem and Sarah are both saddened, but the gang presses on. They make it to the garage, where Javi's fight with David would begin. Clementine would then break the fight up, and David would decide to leave. Clem really didn't have much choice in any of the flashbacks this time around, so the game transitions from Javi to Clementine as the playable character. You choose whether you want to go after David and Gabe, or save Richmond. You'd also be making sure Lee is okay if you choose the second choice. As for Sarah, she would go to save Richmond if both Clem and Javi go after Gabe. This is because there are only 2 seats on the motorcycle. But if only one person or nobody does, she would ask Clem what she should do, and Clem can say which one. So now, let's get into the interesting part, the endings of A New Frontier. Ending number 1. Javi, Clem, and Sarah all go save Richmond, Kate survives, and the gang would reunite with Lee and Jesus. Javi would then go with Kate to find Gabe bitten and put him down. They'd also bury David's dog tags, so in this ending, both Gabe and David die, but Kate survives. Ending number 2, only one person goes after Gabe, whether it be Javi, Sarah, or Clem. Richmond will be saved, with Kate surviving and David dying. Additionally, if Sarah was the one to save Gabe, his crush would go from Clem to her instead. And so, now Gabe and Kate are both alive. Ending number 3, Clem and Sarah go after Gabe and David. Both David and Gabe survive in this ending, but since Javi didn't go, this means he wouldn't ask David to return, so David won't come back to Richmond. But Kate survives too, so in this ending, all 3 of them survive, but David isn't coming back, so he's just gone. Ending number 4, Javi goes to save Gabe, along with either Clem or Sarah. This one is going to have David and Gabe survive as well, with Javi choosing whether David comes back. Kate does die though, unfortunately. And lastly, ending number 5 is basically just the last ending, but with Krista alive. Since Krista and Clem/Sarah would be there, they would be more than enough to save Kate. So after counting it out, it means that Kate survives in 4 out of 5 endings, Gabe survives in 4 as well, and David survives in 3, but he can only return to Richmond in 2. Also, Krista has the potential to survive in all 5 endings if Joan killed someone other than her. Plus, Conrad also survives the whole story no matter what because he was never at odds with the group. If Krista survived, she would approach Javi saying that she forgives him for choosing to let her die. She understands that he was in a tough position, and she apologizes for him losing whoever he lost along the way. She would also tell Lee that she couldn't come with him to find AJ, as she needed to take her time to make things right. She was going to better her own mental health, and also step up to take Richmond in the right direction. It's what Ava would have wanted. Lee accepts this, and he, Clem, and Sarah all head out on the road to find AJ. After successfully saving AJ from a Carroll ranch, Clementine, Lee, and Sarah travel around with him, searching for a new place. They wanted to go back to Richmond, but it was too risky, as the whole area had become a war zone. So a few years would pass, and they would eventually pull up to a train stop. They try to get the supplies, but it would be rigged with a grenade, and so the 4 now attempt to escape, but end up crashing the car into a nearby tree. They would then be taken to Erickson's boarding school and get introduced to the whole gang there. And honestly, most of episode 1 is going to remain the same, with Lee and Sarah going off with whoever Clem and AJ don't go with. AJ would be a lot less paranoid due to having both Sarah and Lee along with Clementine. They're all 3 really good influences on him and make him think a lot more positively. The group would end up going to go get supplies from the train station, leading to them meeting Abel. Lee would not be okay with him coming in and threatening them with a gun. If Lee told Kenny to fight Larry in season 1, he would throw Abel out the window, but if he didn't do that, then he would just try to talk him down. Of course, Clementine has the option to throw him out afterward if Lee doesn't do it. The gang then dips and returns back to the school. Later that night, Clementine would go out to learn what was going on and would find Marlon and Brody arguing. Marlon then kills Brody, and Lee walks in as he tries to escape. The two get into a struggle, but Lee is going to overpower him and knock him to the ground. Clementine then puts Brody down rather than letting her turn, so Lee and Clem take Marlon up to confess what happened. Of course, Marlon would lie, but it would eventually stop and the truth would come out. Because Marlon really wasn't in a position to fight, AJ is a lot more docile, and I don't think he's going to be shooting Marlon. This means the whole kicking them out plot would be thrown out the window, and Marlon would be able to stay, but not as a leader. I don't think the majority of the group would be down with kicking him out or making him a prisoner, so I think this is the best option. And so Violet would take his place, and Marlon would say that he was supposed to meet the other group that day. He'd ask what they should do, and Lee suggests they make a trap. Have Marlon go and bring Lee, Clem, and Sarah. They have the rest of the group surprise attack them and bring them back for questioning. The gang has a mixed response to this, but ultimately agrees on this plan. AJ says that he wants to go, and so they compromise and say that he'll be on the surprise team. Anyway, Clementine heads out with Marlon, Lee, and Sarah, and they meet with Abel and Lily. Clem and Lee recognize Lily, who recognizes them as well. Lily explains the Delta Group and why it's great, and also the war they're part of. Eventually, Violet, Lewis, and Mitch join the group, surrounding the two and asking them to drop their weapons. Abel laughs, asking if this was some kind of joke, and AJ steps out with his gun, saying no. Abel begins to say, well, in that case, and immediately charges AJ, grabbing him by the wrist and taking the gun. Nobody was able to react fast enough since they didn't have guns. Lily had also raised her knife in this time since everyone was distracted, and now Abel would say that he would kill AJ if they didn't let them go. At this point, Clem can either choose to accept the deal or attack to defend AJ. If she accepts the deal, then he puts AJ down, and the two walk away with their guns aimed at the group as they leave. The group is happy that they got them to go away, and that now they'll be safe. However, the thought that they could return with more people had crossed their minds. And so they would prepare. If Clem attacked Abel, they would struggle for the gun, and AJ would help out. At the same time, Lily would grab Marlon and use him as a hostage, allowing for her and Abel to escape, or cover for the arrows that had been firing at her. The group is sad over Marlon being taken by the Delta, and now begins preparing for an attack. Most of this stuff goes the same, but Marlon would be wanting to redeem himself if he's with you. Because of that, he would help out training people to use the bows, and also just pitching in where he could with the training. Lee also joins you in clearing out the greenhouse, and Sarah spends her time learning medical stuff from Ruby. This is in honor of her father, Carlos, being a doctor, and also her just wanting to help people. After all, she's only here because Lee and Clementine helped her. Lee would also have a funny reaction to who you choose to be romantic with, or if you don't choose that, then he won't. And finally, if Marlon is still with you, Sarah would admire how he rose up to the pressure of everyone's scrutiny. And so now we move on to Lily's attack. Omar gets shot in the leg with an arrow, and her troops roll in. Lily had brought Marlon with her in order to use him as a hostage once again, if you didn't save Marlon, obviously. Plus, now when she says Minerva is with her, she has Marlon to back up that claim. At some point, the battle begins, with Mitch charging at Lily and getting killed. This allows for Marlon to go free if he's there, but he does get wounded by a shot. Clementine, Lee, and AJ fall back into a room, and then Abel walks in to fight Clem. Lee would back her up, stabbing AJ through not AJ. Lee would back her up though, stabbing Abel through the side with his hand knife. He'd fall off the ledge with Lee, and so Clem and AJ climbed down. Abel would be beaten without any more resistance though, since he had already been injured more. And so now Clem and AJ proceed to fight off Lily, with Lee jumping in to hold her off. This would be a really close fight, so now Clementine saves either Lewis or Violet, but Sarah would save the other person. This would be a big dub for the group, as now Lily's gang had only managed to take Asim and Omar. So now Clementine and the others have to prepare for the assault. The only problem is that they haven't met James. And so Sarah would present her own idea. Lily and the others used the walkers as a distraction to get out of there before they could stop them. So if they could somehow get a bunch of walkers, they could use them as a distraction to get in. The only problem is that they're just gonna have to get a bunch of walkers together. And so Lee, Clem, and AJ head out and find a barn full of walkers. They say that this is perfect, but would be approached by James. James explains his backstory and his belief about the walkers, and tells them that he'll only let them use the barn if Clementine goes into the barn with the mask. She then does so, and they gain James's trust. They head back to the group, explaining what happened, and then they would have the little party that they did in canon. Sarah will be treating Marlon's injuries and talking to him during this time. Lee would tell the story of how he lost his arm to save Clementine, and how helping people you care about is the most important thing. After that, they head out, and most of this stuff would play out the same, just with Lee there with Clem and AJ. Lee and Clem would be locked in the same cell, and Lily would come back to talk to them. Lee would also be stripped of the knife on his arm, so that's pretty unfortunate for him. Lily would then take AJ, and so now Lee and Clem break out and take down Minerva too. They then head up to the top of the ship, and most of that goes the same, but Lee helps fight Lily, and this leads to him actually beating her. So because of this, AJ pulls his gun, and Clem tells him whether or not to shoot. But if he shoots, he wouldn't go overboard this time, because like I said, he's much less paranoid about everything, and he can think much more rationally. The boiler in the ship then explodes, and everyone dips. Thankfully, Violet keeps her sight, and Lewis keeps his tongue, so there's no trade-off here. Clem, Lee, Sarah, Ten, AJ, and Lewis/Violet go off with James if he's alive. They get trapped in the cave, and James would flip out about AJ killing Lily, but he'd be beaten by both Lee and Clem. This leads to him walking out no matter what, since he hadn't known Clem for that long, and doesn't really have any attachment to her. Clem then gives AJ the go-ahead on the hard calls, or doesn't, depending on your choice, and so they move on. The squad walks to the bridge, and Minerva holds them up. Here, Lee and Clem both beat up Minerva, so Lee gets his leg cut open instead. At this point, he is forced to jump the gap, but with only one arm, he's gonna need someone to catch him. So Sarah tells Lewis/Violet to go, and that she'll get 10. They do so, and Lee escapes with them. With AJ being much less crazy in this timeline, he hesitates when contemplating shooting 10. This means that Sarah manages to throw 10 across and gets eaten by the walkers herself. I think that this works perfectly, as her arc in Season 2 is all about becoming strong, and her arc this season was to help people, so this sacrifice kind of combines both of those things. She's helping a kid who made bad decisions and was weak mentally, just like she was in Season 2. The group is all extremely sad about this, especially Lee, Clem, and AJ, as they've known her for years by this point. However, they are forced to push onward, and 10 as well as Lewis/Violet get separated from them. So now Lee and AJ climb up the rocky hillside, and Lee gets bitten in the leg. Having the missing arm and leg injury was too much for him to climb fast, so yeah. They quickly come up with the idea to cut off Lee's leg as well, and so they head toward the barn. Thankfully, Clem and AJ protect him from the walkers and use the axe to chop his leg off. They then roll him out of there and get him to the school safely. When there, Marlon would ask about Sarah, and 10 apologizes for getting her killed. This is sad, because Sarah was someone who Marlon really liked, and she seemed to like him back as well. But because of her death, they never get to be together. And after all that, I'm sure they'd find some kind of wheelchair for Lee, or maybe even build him a makeshift one. The ending is pretty nice, with Lee surviving, albeit he doesn't have an arm or a leg, Lewis, Violet, and 10 all surviving unharmed, and Marlon surviving as well. Oh yeah, and Conrad and potentially Krista are both safe and sound in Richmond. So yeah, this has been What If Lee Survived. I hope you all have enjoyed the series, as I really liked how it turned out. I know that this is a very popular subject, as Lee's death was very pivotal and he was a very big character, so seeing him survive has been pretty interesting to write, to be honest. But let me know your guys' thoughts, and also tell me your guys' favorite part that happens in the series. But as always, tell me if you like this series, comment your requests for future videos, and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.